Good evening and welcome. This is Susan Johnson, and this is week 1 of our book club. We are discussing Hashimoto's thyroiditis, the root cause. This is a really great book for anyone who is looking to, oh, there's Dennis. Hi, Dennis. For anyone who's looking to learn about the thyroid, particularly Hashimoto's, it's a great read. The first couple of chapters can be a little technical, but once we get that, we'll go over some of that tonight. We'll spend a little time on the technical, but once we get through that, it'll get a little easier. I see Dennis has jumped on. Dennis is from Wisconsin. Dennis and I go back many, many years. Dennis, you're on with Alice and Dan from Rhode Island and Trisha from Spokane.
Hey, you guys.
Hey, Hi.
So I think one of the biggest revelations that you'll come to when you're reading this book or you do any digging on Hashimoto's is that they believe, and this is, medicines, Mark Starr is another big, this is another big book, Hypothyroidism, Type 2 by Mark Starr. They truly believe that probably over 70% of the people in the world have some type of a thyroid issue, be it hypothyroidism, be it poor thyroid function, hyperthyroidism, or Hashimoto's. And what we'll learn if you've read ahead and if you caught it, is that there's a difference between hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's. So there is a little slight difference in the two. Hashimoto's is a type of hypothyroidism. But I want to kind of go through the book. I really like how she sets this up, and I really wanted you to read chapter 1, the introduction. And I'd like to go over just a couple of things in that first part of the book, because I think they're important to the rest of the book. But before I begin, is anybody having trouble reading the book?
Little technical.
A little technical? Yeah. And it gets easier, Alice, as we go on. We'll get past all this technical stuff. And as she says in the first chapter, the first couple of chapters in after her introduction is really setting up what we know about the thyroid. And for everybody to make it a little easier, I set up a vault area, a member area. And in that member area, I've added some things for you to be able to access. I did a whole vocabulary on some of the different thyroid terms, so you could print it and keep it as you were, maybe reading or were talking. I tried to pick the most, the most popular ones of them, because you start doing TSA and T4 and T3 and TPO, and you're like, oh, I don't even know where to go. So having that little bit of vocabulary there is always really helpful. I know, Alice, I helped this past weekend get into that members area, and if you're having trouble getting in, just let me know. So the first thing I want to read is on page 2. This first paragraph that says, while I was prepared to start Synthroid, so Synthroid is one of the medications that they put many women on who have hypothyroidism. She said, when my body would undergo a gradual decrease in thyroid hormone production, I didn't feel this medication was sufficient to address my autoimmune condition. The supplemental hormone did not stop the destruction of the thyroid gland by the thyroid antibodies. It simply added more hormone when the thyroid was too damaged to produce it on its own. It was like pouring water into a leaky bucket without plugging up the holes causing the leak. And what I want you to take away from this is that when you talk about an autoimmune condition or a thyroid condition, just like high blood pressure, just like high cholesterol, just like some of your different autoimmune diseases, the autoimmune disease is not the problem. There's a deeper issue going on in the body that's causing that particular symptom. Although they call hypothyroidism a disease, it's really a symptom of something wrong in the body. And when you do something like you take Synthroid, you're basically giving the body what it needs so that it doesn't have to produce it. But what's causing you to need that? And that's what the basis of this book is all about. It's trying to figure out what's the root cause. And we'll learn as we go through this that everybody's a little different. Everybody has a different root cause. So you want to know that. The second thing I want to just go quickly over from the bottom of this page is she says, warning, while this book is based on research and results have been reproduced, many of the statements are based on my own personal observations and experience. Furthermore, everyone is unique and the interventions that work for me might not work for others. A lot of the frustration that comes from working with the thyroid is that, let's say we all have a thyroid condition. What works for me won't work for Alice, won't work for Trisha, won't work for Dennis, won't work for Dan. You really have to dig at what's going to help you. And going through some of the stuff in this book might help you identify some things that you might need to address in your own body. So on page 7, at least in my book, and some people might have different versions of this, I like where on the halfway down, she says, despite sleeping over a dozen hours at night, I was anxious, thin, and tired, but wired. If anything, I thought the symptoms of an overactive thyroid, hyperthyroidism seemed to fit me better. When I came later to understand that it is the thyroid antibodies produced in the autoimmune thyroiditis were attacking my thyroid, packets of thyroid hormone were being released into my bloodstream, causing overactive thyroid symptoms, in addition to those of underactive thyroid, the best of both worlds. When you talk to a lot of women, they say, I can't have an underactive thyroid because I'm so thin. I'm thin, you know, and what you'll learn is that it can go back and forth, particularly with hypothyroidism. You can have both the hyper and the hypo at the same time. So you can be thin and anxious. And I come from this because I had hyperthyroidism. I had Graves' disease. My thyroid worked too hard, and I could eat all the food I wanted in the world and I never put on a pound. I was anxious, I couldn't sleep, and my heart was racing to the point where they thought I was going to have a heart attack. So people automatically assume that they have hyper instead of hypo. So you might not, because you can have both that thinness or that kind of stress hyperactivity and still be hypothyroid. Let's see. Next thing I wanted to go was to page 9. She talks about all the things that she tried to overcome Hashimoto's. If you look at this page, it's a little frightening. You know, she tried acupuncture, low-dose naltrexone, fluoride-free toothpaste, kombucha tea, adaptogens, expensive thyroid specialists, compounded thyroid medications, Synthroid, Armor, goitogen avoidance, seaweed snacks, alkalizing the body, medicinal. I mean, this goes on and on and on. She tried all kinds of things and still hadn't figured out what was wrong. So if you've been facing this and you think, I don't know where to go, you just got to keep going at it. Again, we'll go through a lot of this. But I think that that's a big takeaway. For me, it took me a long time to figure out what I can do for my body and what I can't. And I don't know if you can see it tonight, but my thyroid is all upset. This past weekend, I got into stuff I don't normally eat. I was with Alice and Dan. We were at my sister.
Don't blame us. Don't blame us.
Yeah, no, I'm not blaming you. But I got into things like gluten-free carrot cake and gluten-free cookies, and I got into gluten-free clam cakes. But a lot of them are made with things that I don't normally eat. And the first place that my body always tells me I got into something bad is right here on my thyroid. And it's rough. And I know I did. But that's how I know. That's some of the things I've learned about my body. So if you go to page 10, this is really key. I think this is a big thing for anyone that wants to make a start on looking at where to start with your body. She says, I remember saying to my mom, it's like I need to sleep so my body can process everything I ate. When I wake up too early, it's still not processed. She suspected lactose intolerance. I said, I can't be, I thought. Why would it start all of a sudden? Fast forward to the future. On Friday, February 10th, 2012, I started taking 1 capsule of betaine with pepsin for each evening meal containing protein. This is an enzyme. Digesting enzymes are key to your health, be it you're working with cholesterol, you're working with thyroid, you're working with any kind of an autoimmune disease. Making sure that your body is breaking down the food that you eat is absolutely imperative. And where you find that, you really want to look at what type of foods that you eat so you know what type of enzymes to use. That's one of the reasons why I love Young Living's Essentialzyme 4, because it covers the biggies: proteins, sugars, starches, and fats. So it really works on breaking, and sugars, it really breaks down all of those things that you're eating, because your body has to spend a lot of time breaking down food. And in order for your body to be able to use everything, and we'll learn a little bit more about this in the next chapter, it has to break down to those simplest things, like the amino acids that we need. In chapter 2, they're going to talk a lot about tyrosine, which is an amino acid that comes from phenylalanine, and it's all part of how the body makes makes iodine from iodide. So you eat food that has iodide in it, and it needs tyrosine to bind with so it can make iodine so that you can feed your thyroid naturally. So if you can't break down your food, you might not be breaking it down to the point where your body can use that. So using something like an enzyme which breaks the food down completely can be really helpful for anyone facing any kind of an autoimmune disease. So that was really the first chapter that I wanted to read. Hold on one sec. It says I wanted to read one more thing here. That basically, she says, in the next 3 chapters, she summarizes the conventional knowledge about Hashimoto's taught to most physicians during their medical school training. This information is about 15 to 20 years behind the research that will be presented in subsequent chapters, but it will serve as a great starting point. Now, my book was written in 2012. Some of this has been updated since then, but some of it, she's right. There are a lot of docs that completely do not understand what we're going to go over, particularly when we talk about testing and you know, what is a normal thyroid test and what comes in. Does anybody want to say anything about chapter 1 before we move on? Questions or some of the things that were a big takeaway for you?
No, we're good.
That's good. She went through a lot, that's for sure.
Don't you feel bad?
Yeah.
You know, Mark Starr has this, again, this interesting, this is real, you want to think that's technical. This one is way more technical, but they talk a lot in here about how hard thyroid is. And you'll see some pictures. Let me see if I can find, but they talk a lot about how many people have hypothyroidism and how damaging it can be, and how a lot of people who have a lot of swelling in their face and their body, like, I don't know if you can see this picture. Look at the difference. This is after they treated her for hypothyroidism. Look at how puffy she is. So they talk a lot about people being puffy, and that there's almost a gelatinous substance that forms underneath the skin when you have hypothyroidism. And I'll show it here. You can see on this arm here, see them pinch there? So there are pinch tests that you can do, but they say it's prevalent. I mean, they'll show you that kids as young as 2, 4, 5, all the way up to people in their 80s and 90s can have hypothyroidism. And a lot of them go through a lot and never ever realize that they have an issue because they test normal.
Wow. Crazy.
So any questions or other thoughts about chapter 1?
Good, right?
Go ahead, Tricia.
Yeah, I mean, what she's gone through here, I have gone through so many of these steps myself. And Sue, you and I have talked about this a little bit, but like her, all my life, I have tested high one time, low another time. And, you know, last year, one of my docs said, okay, well, if this is this way next year, we're going to have to put you on something. And so the process, it's kind of overwhelming. And sometimes you're not sure what is helping and what is not helping. So I'm really excited to work through this book. And I appreciate the reminder at the end of this chapter that the next couple of chapters are what medical science is. Because I'm like, no, this is not the approach I want to take. I know there's got to be something else. So absolutely. I appreciate the hope that, you know, that there are some answers.
Yeah, and I really believe there are. You know, I really believe that a lot of it, though, again, I think the hardest thing for anybody facing any type of an autoimmune issue or something chronic is that it takes time and you have to dig. And it really takes a lot of dedication. And there are a lot of people who aren't looking to go through all of that to try to get to the bottom of it. So be it no matter what you're fighting, you really have to work on it. And there's a lot that goes into it. But when you get to that point, like I look at myself and I look at where I am and where I was, you know, probably back now 8 or 9 years ago, I'm in a completely different space. I look better, I feel better, I have more energy, and I now know what to look for, right? I know when I get into something and I know what I need to do. And you can get there, but it's not an easy road. The good thing about that is there's people like, you know, Izabella Wentz and others that have gone through this that we can kind of maybe use as a bouncing board for ourselves to really kind of jump off of and take a good look at. So let's kind of dive into chapter 2 and see if we can't demystify some of this. And I've really tried hard to try to break this down to a very simple level. So first thing, what is the thyroid? So as you know, the thyroid's the butterfly gland that's right here, okay? And one of the things they'll talk about is a goiter. And a goiter is when you get a nodule that can grow right here. And a lot of times goiters are because you can't uptake what you need to uptake, And the thyroid enlarges itself and the cells enlarge because it thinks it needs more to process it, and yet it can't do it. So it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So you get that goiter, and they'll often feel for those nodules, and that's a good indication that something is wrong. Your thyroid can't uptake. And when I first got into this, I started having little goiters. I don't have them anymore. And for one of the big things that I did, which we haven't discussed here, and I'll just throw this out there now, is that I had all my silver fillings removed. My silver fillings were causing my thyroid a lot of congestion. And it took a lot of detoxing and working with it, but I no longer have those goiters. Now, when you have hyperthyroidism, so not hypo, the other thing you often get is the bug eyes. Your eyes will bug when you get, you see people have very big, my aunt has it because hyperthyroidism runs in my family. My aunt has very big eyes and they tend to pop out. That's another signal that you have hyperthyroidism as opposed to hypothyroidism. So I took this information from the book. I kind of extracted it down. Those first 2 pages, 15 and 16, are big. So here we go. Iodide, which you get from the food you eat, is iodide absorbed from the food, circulates in our blood. So we eat, we chew, the enzymes break it down, and iodine circulates in our blood, and it's absorbed by the thyroid gland, where it must be converted into a form usable by the body, okay? So it can't just take that. It actually has to convert that. So it has to make it something it can use, all right? So I don't know, I'm not really sure what I could use as a good example of that, but you need 2 things. So you need iodine and you need tyrosine to work together in order to form iodine, okay? So there's a process that when these 2 combine, and that is called thyroid peroxidase. It's an enzyme that converts iodide to the active iodine, okay? So iodide, tyrosine, through the process, through this enzyme, thyroid peroxidase, TPO, it forms iodine, okay? Very important. In that process, the body makes hydrogen peroxide. That's a byproduct or a waste of this process to make iodine. And there are times when you can actually have an illness from not being able to get rid of that hydrogen peroxide. Okay, so that's the first thing. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Now, once it's done this, it's ready to bind with other molecules. The reactive iodine attaches, again, so now it's going to attach to the tyrosine, okay, through iodization, all right? Now, it's going to make little molecules. It's going to make little T1 and T2 molecules. So thyroid 1 and thyroid 2 are made from this process when they combine, okay? From here, the thyroid 1s and the thyroid 2s are going to combine. So you're either going to get a 1 and a 2 together to equal a T3, or a T2 and a T2 together to make a T4. So now we're making building blocks. Although you can have all 4, only T3 and T4 can be used by the body. T1s and T2s are just sitting there waiting to find a partner. Am I going to find a T1 or am I going to find a T2? Woo, okay? So you end up with either a T3 or a T4. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, T3, about 20% of the T3 that we make, okay, is, let me think about this. So hold on. All right, so they're both biologically active, but T4 is about 300% less bioavailable to the body than T3, okay? So the body can use T3, but T4 doesn't like it as much. So we have to then go through another process and convert T4 to T3 by losing 1 molecule. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So when they test you, they're going to test you for T3 and T4. Okay. And they're also going to look for things called free T and free T3 and free T4. And that means that it's available for the body to use. So don't get concerned about that. But so there's T3 and T4, and some are free and available to be used. Make sense?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So 20% of our T3 comes from thyroid secretion. So 20% automatically comes from a T1 and a T2 going together. The other 80% has to come from that T4 conversion. All right? So we have to be able to convert that T4. All right? So 80% of the T4, when T4 is converted to T3 through this whole process, which removes one iodine, is done in the liver and the kidney.
Mm.
So when you are talking about cleaning up your thyroid and your thyroid process, what's going to be important?
Clean your liver and your kidney.
Cleaning your liver and your kidney. If you have congested livers and kidneys, and livers today are so congested, your body cannot convert T4.
Mm.
All right? So making sure that you are keeping clean organs, clean liver, clean kidney, and this is another whole conversation for another day, but that's very vital to good thyroid health. Okay? Questions?
Nope, I think we're good. We're good.
Okay. Move to my next page.
I do actually have a question,
Sure.
and this might be addressed later in the book, and that's the whole, and I'm sorry, this kind of goes a little off topic, but Dr. Purser talks about pituitary damage, and it's the pituitary that actually produces TSH. And it's a very common and easy thing to damage your pituitary significantly. So I'm wondering, does she talk about this at all?
Yeah, she knows.
She will get into a little bit, but not as
Okay.
much. We will touch on it because Mark Starr touches on it greatly. So
Okay.
your hypothalamus and your pituitary are important to the cycle of the thyroid, okay? And what Trish is saying is that your pituitary gland is very important to the TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone, which is what is called up when your thyroid levels are low. When your thyroid levels are low, the body says, we need stimulating hormone because we've got to make more thyroid. The pituitary gland is very important in that process. If you study the pituitary gland, things like being a cheerleader and being dropped from being held, football players being banged, car accidents, gymnasts can often have issues with their pituitary gland because it actually can get damaged very easily. So you're right, Tricia, that it's very important, and we will cover that at some point. But she doesn't necessarily get that deep. She talks more about the health of the thyroid than the calling up of the TSH, but that's really important. So if you are not producing enough thyroid, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, is produced, so you'll make more thyroid. If you have hyperthyroid, you have too much thyroid hormone and TSH is stopped. You don't produce that because you don't want more hormone, okay? The last thing I want to talk about when we talk about converting from T4 to T3, there's a very important mineral that you must have in order to do that. Actually, there's two, but the big one is zinc. Zinc needs to be in the body in order to convert T4 to T3. So what do you want to make sure you have? A good source of zinc. Making sure that your diet has zinc in it or that you're supplementing with a really quality zinc is another piece of the puzzle when you talk about thyroid health. The other one that's really important is going to be selenium. Selenium has another function in this. Selenium is a trace mineral. You do not need much selenium, but selenium is also important in the thyroid function. Selenium is something you can get from Brazil nuts. There's a number of other things you can get selenium from, but a lot of your young living vitamins, minerals, and things like that have selenium in them, as well as zinc. My favorite is Master Formula. Master Formula gives you 136% of your daily allowance of both zinc and selenium. And she's going to talk in a further chapter about some of the other things that she believes are really important. Master Formula is going to tick every single box but one. So this is, if you're looking for something to support your body and support your thyroid, Master Formula is an excellent, excellent multivitamin. Okay, so as we said, hypothyroidism is an inadequate amount of thyroid production. Hyper is an over adequate, too much, and you need selenium and zinc in order to have healthy thyroid function, as well as iodine. And we're going to talk a lot about iodine in a minute, because Hashimoto, people who have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, don't necessarily need iodine. Iodine can be like adding fuel to the fire for Hashimoto's sufferers. So, all right, so let's get into, so before I go any further, any other questions about that? And then we're going to start to really dig into the book. Any
No, we're good.
questions about T1s, T2s, T3s, T4s?
Nope, we're good.
Okay, cool. So, in here, she talks a little bit about iodine, hypothyroidism, and Hashimoto's. Hypothyroidism was a big issue back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. They started adding iodine to salt, Morton's iodine salt. They found that a lot of the hypothyroidism disappeared because of the fact that we use iodized salt. So if you are a Hashimoto sufferer, iodine might not be the thing for you, so you need to watch what you're using when it comes to salt. If you are a person that uses Himalayan salt, you really watch your diet, you don't eat out a lot, you really watch your home diet, you know, again, Himalayan pink salt and those type of things, sea salt, you're not going to get that iodine in those particular things. So you might be someone that needs to supplement with iodine if you don't have Hashimoto's, okay? So if you're looking to support your thyroid, one of the things you might want to do is look at how much iodine you intake. You can get it from, there's a lot of things you get it from, but many of those things are often bad for your autoimmune disease. So you can get it from things like eggs, dairy, wheat, soy, all part of autoimmune disease. You can also get it from protein sources like beef and chicken and those type of things. So having iodine is not a bad thing if you've not been diagnosed with a thyroid condition. And you say, well, how would I know if my body needs iodine or not? If you use an iodine supplement, or you have some, you know someone who has one, if you put an iodine supplement on your wrist, it turns a little bit of a color, like yellow. If your body sucks in all that iodine and it goes clear within about 5 minutes, you need to take iodine. Don't have that happen and it sits on your skin, you don't need iodine.
Oh,
Interesting way to test that.
simple.
But it
Yeah.
has to be a good quality iodine.
Oh, that's okay.
Okay?
Yep.
So
Wait, Sue, so even just like a liquid iodine, if it's a food grade, you can try that?
you should be able to try that. Yep.
Oh,
You should be able
cool.
to try
Awesome.
it. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. It's a trick that we learned when we did our certified natural health practitioners school. So it was kind of fun to learn.
Does it matter where you put it?
Put it on your wrist. So
On the
put it
wrist?
right in here.
Okay.
So that you can see it, and you take a watch, or you can put it on in your elbow here. You want
Okay.
some place that's got a thin skin so you can see.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. And then places that you can get iodine that are kind of fun with Young Living, again, you get it from Master Formula, but Ningxia Nitro has iodine in it as well. So if you like to give that little shot of nitro in the morning, it's also a great place to get a little bit of iodine.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So I want to go to page 17, and I want to talk a little bit about the common symptoms. So she says at the top of page 17, common symptoms of hypothyroidism or thyroid hormone deficiency include slow metabolism, weight gain, forgetfulness, feeling cold or having cold intolerance, depression, fatigue, dry skin, constipation, loss of ambition, hair loss, muscle cramps, stiffness, joint pain, and a loss of the outer third eyebrow, menstrual irregularities, infertility, and weakness. So a lot of women will lose this part of their eyebrow. They get very thin in this part of their eyebrow. That's another good look. If you're looking at someone and you're doing an assessment on them, you look to see if their eyebrows have thinned. That's a good indication that they have a thyroid issue. And I also think that if you look here, she talks a lot about depression and anxiety. And they really believe that if you can stabilize your thyroid, for some people, that can be the key to stabilizing their depression and anxiety. So something very important to think about. So This is also a place on page 17 where she talks about the difference between iodine deficiency versus Hashimoto's. When there is a deficiency in the building blocks required to make thyroid hormone, iodine, selenium, zinc, and tyrosine, TSH, thyroid stimulating, right, is triggered to signal the additional production of TPO, that's the enzyme that converts for you, to start converting the stored iodine to a stable form. This also results in that, again, that hydrogen peroxide. If no iodide is available, the body will attempt to increase thyroid hormone production, making bigger thyroid cells, thus resulting in the enlarged thyroid gland known as a goiter. Iodine deficiency is the leading cause of hypothyroidism in many underdeveloped countries and can cause both hypothyroidism as well as goiter. So we've already talked about all that, right? In the United States and many European countries, however, where iodine is added to the salt and other foods, Hashimoto's is the leading cause of hyperthyroidism, not iodine deficiency. Hashimoto's is responsible for 90% of the hyperthyroidism cases in the US. That's huge. Okay. Let's see. She gives you a test on page 18 to see if you have an enlarged thyroid. I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Let's see, page 19. So on page 19, she talks about what Hashimoto's actually is, and I think this is important to go over. Hashimoto's thyroiditis is an autoimmune condition. Autoimmune meaning our body is attacking itself, that results in the destruction of the thyroid gland. This damage eventually leads to inadequate thyroid hormone production or hypothyroidism. As mentioned above, Hashimoto's is the most common cause of hyperthyroidism in the United States and accounts for 90% of the cases. Hashimoto's thyroiditis is also known as chronic thyroiditis, lymphocytic thyroiditis, lymphanoid goiter, and recently autoimmune thyroiditis. The condition was first described in 1912 by a Japanese physician, Hakuro Hashimoto, so that's where it gets its name. Okay, Hashimoto usually begins as a gradual enlargement of the thyroid gland, which is sometimes detectable by the patient on self-examination. It can be accompanied by a hoarseness or breathing difficulty, and occasionally patients experience tenderness or pain. When damage to the gland is just beginning, the body compensates and produces more hormone, thus keeping the hormone levels within normal ranges. So this is why sometimes you test for thyroid and they say, you're normal, because the body is actually overcompensating, okay? The person may start noticing symptoms of hypothyroidism. However, mild hypothyroidism may be noticed in some patients, while in others, thyroxetosis, too much thyroid hormone, can be present. This beginning stage is described as subclinical hypothyroidism, defined as an increased TSH accompanied by a normal T3 and T4. So again, you can have the beginning stages of this, but still test completely normal. You really need to think about how your body feels, and we'll talk about in later chapters about tests that you can take to see if your body's in that stage, okay? So progressively, as more thyroid tissue is destroyed, the thyroid loses its ability to compensate and the person becomes deficient in thyroid hormone. Eventually, this results in the gland's complete loss of ability to produce thyroid hormone, considered to the end stage of Hashimoto's. In Hashimoto's, two types of self-reactive antibodies can be seen. So this is important. There are two types of destructive antibodies, okay? There is the thyroid peroxidase antibodies, the TPO-AB, and about 80% of the people with Hashimoto's have thyroglobulin antibodies, TGAB, and they can test for those. A good endocrinologist or a good more functional medicine doc will help you test for these things. You can get those tests done, okay? Questions on that? Is it starting to make a little more sense, Alice?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. It's a lot. It's a real lot when you look at it. Okay. So go to page 21, and down at the bottom it says risk factors. So there is a genetic predisposition to developing Hashimoto's, and the condition tends to run in families. Thus, relatives of those with Hashimoto's are at risk. Hashimoto's thyroiditis can occur in two varieties: an organ wasting form, atrophic. It's associated with the HLA-DR3 gene inheritance, and enlarged thyroid, goiterous form, through the HLA-DR5 inheritance. These genes are common in Caucasian populations. So if you have someone in your family who had Hashimoto's, there's a good chance that you'll get it. And if you have it, there's a good chance someone in your family, your children, your sister, or going up will get it as well. Well-established environmental triggers for developing Hashimoto's in those who are genetically predisposed include iodine intake, bacterial and viral infections, hormonal imbalances, toxins, and therapy with certain types of medication. Cigarette smoking, surprisingly, has been associated with a reduced risk of Hashimoto's. That just kills me.
Go figure.
But again, when you look, so this is important. When they talk about predisposition, remember that although you're predisposed doesn't mean that you get it. There are triggers in your body that will trigger these things to happen. And as this book was written a long time ago, if you look at all of the new research on Alzheimer's, you're going to see the same thing. We often, and as well as the BRCA gene in breast cancer, we might be predisposed to get it, but it's environmental triggers, it's our emotional state, it's the supplementation, it's the food, it's the beauty, cosmetics, all those kind of things that will actually trigger the body to start doing these things. So a lot of what we're going to talk about later is going to be how to reduce the predisposition triggers that can actually trigger this to happen. That make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, let's see. On the next page, they talk about screening tests. They say that, you can do ultrasounds. I'm not going to get into a lot of this really deep unless anybody has any great questions. But if you read the part screen, TSH is used as a screening test for thyroid function. But this test does not always catch thyroid abnormalities. TSH does not become permanently elevated until Hashimoto's is advanced. Thus, people may have a normal TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, for years while experiencing unpleasant thyroid symptoms. They will present to their physicians with complaints of weight gain, fatigue, and other symptoms, like brain fog's another big one, coldness, things like that, and be told their thyroid tests are normal. TSH levels can fluctuate throughout the day, however, and the body often compensates by shifting energy away from metabolism and other body functions. Untreated hyperthyroidism eventually results in the abnormally elevated TSH. In contrast, untreated hyperthyroidism results in an abnormally low TSH. A person with Hashimoto's may fluctuate between the two extremes and at time have normal readings. So again, when you have hyper, you're always low, but when you have hypo, you can test both high and low, and it can fluctuate. So like Tricia, you're talking about, your doctor keeps seeing high and low and high and low. This could be the start of something for you where you're going to want to really look at that, right? That next part, she kind of goes through a little bit of what we've already talked about. Most conventional physicians use TSH screening to determine whether a patient has a thyroid disorder, but it is often misleading since levels of circulating hormone may fluctuate at different times. Hashimoto's may cause individuals to fluctuate between high and low. Again, we already talked about that. I'm really glad to see Dennis and Dan on here, because one of the interesting things for guys is that guys can have thyroid issues, but they never talk about it. If you go on to that back side of the vault, I actually put up today the test that you can do to test whether your temperature is the right. So a good way to look, if you're testing both negative and positive, or you're come back as normal and you think, gosh, this isn't right, there are tests that you can do. And one is a basal test, a basal temperature test. You need a basal thermometer, and in that little write-up I put in there, it'll show you what kind of thermometer you get. We used to have mercury thermometers, we used it, but you can't. They now have alcohol thermometers. You can't use this kind. You have to use one of the ones that you can actually oral or anally use. You want a clean one. But what you're going to do is you're going to test underneath your armpit, and you're going to test it. You need a good night's sleep in order to do it. You need to make sure that if you're a person who's cold, you don't have a heated water bed, or you haven't added a lot of blankets on, because that can elevate the body temperature. But you're going to take your temperature for about 10 minutes under the armpit while you lay in bed, and you're going to look at it. And I give you the range. If it's above a certain point, it's normal. But if you keep testing below that point, you probably have some type of hypothyroidism and need to address your body. So you'll have normal tests, but that basal temperature test will come up abnormal. And I outline the days you want to do it, if you still have a cycle. If you're a man, you can do it at any point. But the most important thing is you get a good night's rest. that you haven't eaten a lot of food for about 12 hours before, so you do that kind of fasting, and that you don't get up before you test. You need to have it by the bedside so you can test before you get out of bed, and you kind of track it. You're best to track it for 3 to 5 days, but if you only track it for 2 and it's really off, you could go with that, but I would really track it for 3 to 5 days. And that's a great test to see if your body has something off with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And like I said, that's on the back of the website, and that is taken from this this Markstar book. He actually outlines it. I actually take his test, I've retyped it and put it in there and give him full credit for that. And it actually comes out of a guy that did major tests back in the early 1900s. It was a test that he did before they had a lot of this other screening. All right, so where are we? We're at 8:23, so we're getting close. So what else did I want to talk about in here? Hashimoto tests, let's see. Studies show once the autoimmune attack ceases, the damaged thyroid has the ability to regenerate. A lot of people don't feel that you can regenerate your thyroid. A lot of people never felt your brain could regenerate. New studies are showing that both the thyroid, the brain, actually the liver as well can regenerate if you catch it early enough. Thyroid ultrasounds show normal thyroid tissue has regenerated. The person no longer tests positive for thyroid antibodies. So she talks about in here, she gives you a list of the best tests to take. That's on my book, it's on page 25. As many thyroid symptoms are nonspecific, they are often disregarded by the medical community during initial stages. Patients are dismissed as having depression, stress, or anxiety. Thyroid patients are prescribed antidepressants or anti-anxiety medications without consideration of the thyroid function. So very important that you look at that. She also mentions that people with bipolar disorder as well as depressive and anxiety disorders were to have a higher prevalence for anti-thyroid antibodies to further complicate the issue. Lithium, a medication, okay, so that's, we don't need to worry about that. But again, people who have those antibodies, and so we should probably talk a little bit about antibodies. Hold on. Where is the bit about antibodies? I want to go over that because that's really important. Hold on. Let me just find this little bit. I had outlined it because I wanted to talk about it. Okay, so in most cases of Hashimoto's thyroiditis, blood tests reveal 1 or 2 types of anti-thyroid antibodies. Thyroid peroxidase antibodies, which we talked about already, the TPOAB, are the most common, but antibodies against thyroglobulin, TGAB, are often found as well. These antibodies may appear decades before a change in TSH is detected. So having an antibody test, which you can have, most functional docs will do this. A lot of your normal docs won't, and they'll tell you that the tests are more expensive. But to give you an idea, I don't have typical health insurance, and I recently had all these tests done. I had 10 tubes of blood and a urine sample done. It cost me $144.
Wow.
Paying cash, it's cheap to have these tests done. So if your doctor won't do it, ask them if they'll call or if they'll have the test, and ask them if they'll find out how much those tests will cost, because they can be cheaper. So antibodies, so high concentrations of TPO antibodies have been associated with distress, obsessive compulsive symptoms, and anxiety. This is likely due to an increased amount of thyroid hormone being rushed into the bloodstream, causing a transient hyperthyroidism, so revs you up. Anyone who has experienced symptoms of hyperthyroidism can describe how agitating this feels. People with anxiety or depression and other mood disorders should have their thyroid function checked, especially for TPO antibodies. Some individuals with lifelong psychiatric diagnoses have been able to recover after receiving proper thyroid care. This is huge, right? And having been a person who had hyperthyroidism, you race and 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 race, and you can't calm your mind down, and then you totally crash and fall asleep by 7 o'clock at night, and then you're up in the middle of the night racing, 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 racing. I mean, it's amazing, and you can get a little cranky at certain times. So you know, that hyperthyroidism piece of this can be really annoying. Let's see. All right. Any questions about all of that stuff? A lot of stuff. Questions?
I guess I'm just interested. Susan, I'm just trying to figure out what, because my sister Barbara is diagnosed with I can't say that, Hashimoto. And my mother had, I can't figure out which one it is. She had hyper, I think. She had to drink something and kill it.
So she had to kill her thyroid.
Yeah.
So she was hyperthyroid.
Hyper, right, because she lost weight. That's hyper, right?
Yep,
So
yep. Now, you can be hypo and lose weight, but mostly hyperthyroidism, they'll do different things. They'll destroy it, so they'll radiate it. You drink that stuff. My mother actually back in the 50s had part of hers removed. She only has a quarter of her thyroid. So yes, so they tend to destroy that thyroid because it's overproducing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it took them forever. We didn't know what was, it took many doctors to figure out what it was.
Yeah, and here's the interesting thing. So I had hyperthyroidism. I'm on no medication. They didn't destroy any, but I had to dig deep to find out what my root causes were. And mine mostly come out of toxicity and foods. So mine were my teeth and mine were a lot of foods. It took me forever to figure that out.
Wow.
So having those thyroid issues, so obviously, you know, if it's in your family like that, this is something that you really want to look at because you could have somewhere in there that same predisposition, but by taking care of yourself, you might be able to avoid it.
Yeah. Okay, so
Okay. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And you know, I think one of the things in here that's kind of interesting. So she talks a lot about restoring. You know, this last chapter. Do you have any questions, Tricia or Dennis?
I did, if Dennis did.
Yeah.
I don't know.
No, I'm here. I'm on mute, so I just to cut back on the background noise. But no, I don't have any.
Okay. Go ahead, Tricia.
This goes back to on page 17, she was talking about silent thyroiditis has been associated with seasonal allergies, viral infections, etc. And I'm just thinking, you and I have talked about this, but the idea of getting the thyroid right, I mean, golly. But to me, this is also all connected with gut health, right?
And that's, we'll get to that. So that's what we are. You are on the right path immediately. She's going to talk a lot in the upcoming chapters about gut health, about co-infections. So you could have worms, you could have parasites, you could have infections, sinus infections. So we're going to get into a lot of that these co-infections can actually be like adding fuel to the fire. And she goes through a lot of this to figure out that she had co-infections and had to do certain things to figure out. And Dennis, what's interesting is that you and I have talked a lot about a lot of the things that like H. pylori. H. pylori is a big one. And a lot of people have H. pylori. It's a gut infection and can actually have a lot to do with thyroid.
Wow.
Interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So.
Well, sure, because that would have, oh yeah, sure. That makes so much sense, yeah.
Does that make sense? Yep.
Yeah, totally.
So so we'll get into this as we go through. This was probably the toughest chapter to get through. And if you're really struggling, go in and print off my little cheat sheet that I made because it talks about all these things. And you don't really need to know a lot of it, but what you want to know, the big things you want to take away is that T3 and T4 are the biggies and that they require certain things that you do. A good breakdown of your food, zinc, selenium, and that breakdown of that food will take that iodide and turn it into iodine so the body can use it naturally. Okay, so to me, that's really what you need to take away. And that Hashimoto's, people with Hashimoto's might have an issue with iodine and that you want to look at that. So one of the big supplements with Young Living is Thiamine. Thiamine's great. I love Thiamine, but Thiamine gives you a lot of iodine as well as it gives you porcine and bovine, what do you want to call it? We'll get to it, but it's an actual part of the thiamine, which is great for people who want to support. But if you have Hashimoto's thyroiditis and you have a bad case of it, feeding it iodine could make you feel worse. It could make you feel tired. It could make you feel sluggish. So it's something that you'd want to look at. Very interesting. Another question, Tricia? Nope. Okay, let me finish this up real quick. We're right at the time, but I want to go over just a couple of things in chapter 3, and then I'll let you go because I don't want to take up a lot of time. Okay, so She starts with by saying conventional medicines focus on restoring normal thyroid function through the use of supplemental hormones. If we are to use the analogy of a cup with a hole in it leaking liquid to symbolize the depletion of thyroid hormones, conventional medicine does not consider the source of the leak, autoimmune destruction. It simply keeps adding more water to the cup. So if you're not going to look at why it's happening, throwing stuff to make it work naturally is only going to destroy your body more. You have to fix what's wrong. Now, you might need to throw stuff at it while you fix the leak, but you got to fix the leak. The leak is what's causing all the issues. And this is true of Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, and many of these other things are all being now considered autoimmune diseases, lupus, and that you have to figure these root causes. So I think that's really important. Let's see, page 29. So on page 29, she talks about which medications are best for you. I'm going to leave this for now because I personally would like to see people try to figure out the root cause. And this is something you and your doctor need to discuss. It's not something that I probably should be discussing with anybody about what medications might be right for you. If anybody wants to have a conversation outside of this about medications, I'd be happy to do that. But this is a lot of information about medications that we probably don't need to go into at this point. I do want to skip to to page 36, where she says, are medications lifelong? She says, I'd like to start off by saying medications are a great tool in the arsenal available to overcome Hashimoto's, and they're a tremendous benefit while we fix the issues contributing to our autoimmune thyroiditis. Despite the 20% spontaneous recovery rate, most physicians tell their patients supplementation is lifelong. Perhaps it is easier and less expensive to have someone on pills for life instead of running tests and attempting to taper down a medication. In some cases, a person might become hyperthyroid, which necessitates a medication dose reduction. In other cases, the medication gets built into our physiology due to hormonal feedback, and internal hormone synthesis turns off because there is enough supplemental hormone circulating. If this occurs, thyroid stimulating hormone or thyroid releasing hormone tests should be done to see if the thyroid function has recovered. Lifestyle interventions can also help with reducing TPO antibodies, reversing hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's, and preventing other diseases, and they make most people feel better. Some may be able to reduce and eliminate the need for thyroid medications when the autoimmune attack ceases and the thyroid gland is able to regenerate. When I was on hyperthyroidism medication, I went slow. I mean, it got to the point where I felt like I was in slow. I mean, it was awful. And I started playing with my medication. Many of you heard me tell the story. I started to self-medicate because I didn't like it. I didn't like how I felt. I had an amazing endocrinologist, one of the best in the state of Rhode Island. And her answer to me was, just go into hypothyroidism and we'll push you on Synthroid for the rest of your life. That to me was a huge red flag. And I then started seeking all natural ways to support my body. It took me a little while, but again, today I am medication free and all my tests come back normal. I'm asking them to give me the deeper normal. I want my numbers so I can see that because I asked for all those and I should get those sometime this week, but you can reverse it, especially if you catch it early enough. As they said, the challenge with being on, like I've had people try to work off their medication years later and they've been on it for 20 years and you just can't do it because the body's just shut down. So catching it early is really important. Doesn't mean you can't, and I would never suggest that anybody comes off their medication, but through lifestyle changes and through working through some of these things, you might realize that you could taper down, because in hypothyroidism, if you taper down and it starts to fix itself, you start to rev up and you get more energy. So that would mean you go back to your doc and you'd ask them to test you again because things might be changing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. That's really all I wanted to go on because that's really the end of it. Any other questions? No?
We're good.
No.
All right.
No.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you for coming on. Next week we're reading chapters 4, 5, and 6, I think. And this is really some fun stuff to get into. 4, 5, 6, and 7. Although we'll cover it. It'll be easier to cover because we don't have all that science. What is an autoimmune condition? Finding your root cause. Digestion and depletion. Digestion is one of my favorite subjects. And so, Tricia, that we'll get into a lot of stuff there. And the iodine controversy, which we've already actually talked about. So it gets easier from here. because, you know, we're going to talk about more fun stuff. We're going to talk about digestion and finding your root cause. You have one more chapter that's kind of big, and that talks about autoimmune disease. But this is really important for you to understand what's going on when we talk about Hashimoto's or hypothyroidism. Okay?
Okay.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Right, we'll have more people on next week. I'm hoping the folks that couldn't jump on tonight will jump on next week. But I will put this in the playback. If you have someone that wants to join, it's not too late. They could listen to this and they can jump on. And they can certainly register, and I can make sure they get all the information up to this point.
Awesome.
All right?
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue.
Thanks. Bye, guys.
Night.
Bye.